Have you ever found yourself trying to create a string array in C++ only to hit a wall with macros? It can be frustrating, right? If that's you, then you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into how to create a string array using a preprocessor macro. I totally get it. You might think, why would I even need a macro for this? But trust me, when you're dealing with complex macros that require a variable number of arguments, this can be a game changer. You're not alone in this struggle. Here's the specific question we're tackling today. One user asked, is there a way to create a stead string or char pointer array with a preprocessor macro? They provided an example that looks like this. String myStrings equals magic macro ABC. Sound familiar? Let's explore this together. So, what's the challenge here? The user wants to create a string array using a macro that can handle a variable number of arguments. This can be tricky because macros are processed before the actual compilation, which limits their flexibility. But don't worry, we can work through this. And stick around. At the end of this video, I'll share a pro tip that will help you streamline your macro usage even further. To create a string array using a preprocessor macro in C++, the user can define a macro that takes a variable number of arguments. This will allow for flexibility in the number of strings included in the array. Next, the user can utilize this macro to initialize the string array. By passing the desired strings as arguments to the macro, it will expand correctly into the array format. If the user needs to handle a more complex scenario with additional types or formatting, they can modify the macro accordingly. This allows for greater customization based on specific requirements. Finally, the user should test the implementation to ensure that the macro works as intended. They can do this by compiling the code and checking the output of the string array. Fun fact, did you know that the C preprocessor is one of the earliest forms of code generation? It's like the magician behind the curtain, making your code more powerful before it even runs. Now let's look at the answers provided by other users. An alternative solution provided by another user involves using macros to create a string array. They define two main macros, eval and map, to handle recursion and process each argument. The magic macro is defined to expand the arguments into a string array format. This approach allows for up to 1,024 arguments without additional libraries. The user also provides a link to a repository for further exploration of these macros. That wraps up that answer. Let's move on to another one. An alternative solution provided by a user involves using the Boost preprocessor library. They define a macro called magic macro that utilizes Boost PPC for each I to process a variable number of arguments. This approach allows you to create a string array from a list of elements, effectively converting them into string literals. That wraps up that answer. Let's move on to another one. An alternative approach to creating a string array in C++ using macros involves defining separate macros for different counts of strings. This method utilizes a two-level stringify macro pattern. For example, you can create macros like string array 1 for 1 string, string array 2 for 2 strings, and string array 3 for 3 strings. Each macro uses the xstringify macro to convert the input into string literals. If you need a single macro that accepts a variable number of arguments, the user notes that it can become quite complex, as shown in other answers. Human, let's check out another perspective from a different user. An alternative approach, shared by another user, involves using a macro technique to generate a string array. They define a macro called forEachApply that applies a generate macro to each string. This allows you to create a string array without manually typing each string. Here's the pro tip I promised. Always document your macros clearly. This will save you time and confusion later, especially when working with complex code. And there you have it. You now know how to create a string array using a preprocessor macro in C++. Remember, macros can be powerful tools when used correctly. If you found this helpful, hit that subscribe button for more programming tips, and don't miss our next video where we dive deeper into advanced macro techniques.